Well, it's sad to admit, but for any observant Catholic, there's really no shortage of things to object to if you are to survey the landscape of the church and its leadership. There's frankly a lot of corruption, and you don't have to look far to be exposed to it. Just read a publication like The Pillar, for example, which is certainly a moderate voice in the church, I would say, and you'll find a lot of news stories that, in my experience, will make your skin crawl. Just the other day, I was reading a story about a Canadian bishop's reassignment in what should have been I would say, joy-filled occasion. But there's mention of a deacon who is something of a local celebrity being part of the welcoming committee. And apparently this deacon is a local DJ and a film actor, which when I read that, it kind of piqued my curiosity. So I looked him up. What I found were video clips of him on his Instagram page performing his DJ set with a mostly naked stripper performing just over his shoulder, which he felt was a fitting representation of his artistic expression to be shared with everyone on the internet. This is someone that the Catholic Church looked at and said, in this climate of clergy scandal, this is someone we should bring to the sacrament of holy orders. Meanwhile, precisely because of the clergy abuse scandals, someone like my wife, in order to participate in our daughter's Little Flowers Club at our parish, she has to go and get a criminal records check and follow all kinds of strictly enforced, and I would add, dehumanizing policies composed by insurance companies who know or care nothing about the church's mission in order to have a tea party with other girls from the parish. But strip club DJs are perfectly appropriate for ordination to the diaconate. And because of this kind of insanity, it's no surprise that there's also no shortage of voices and publications who have made it their calling card to draw as much attention to outrages associated with church corruption as possible. Outrage Catholic media has become like its own cottage industry. And when you combine that with the incentives of social media algorithms, which reward sensationalism and clickbait, you end up with a monster that nobody, even those participating in it, I think intended to contend with. But there's only so much of the outrage and corruption that a person can pay attention to before it starts to strip us of our hope and lead us to despair. So it's also not that surprising that there's a whole growing contingency of the faithful who have reacted harshly to the outrage news cycle and would rather insist that everything is amazing and the church and the pope and the bishops are all super based and nothing but absolute blind obedience to them will suffice. The reality is, it's just a lot more complicated than that. And like any true virtue, the right response is somehow between those excessive poles. It's true that as faithful Catholics, we have to exercise obedience and humility. It's also true that we can't ignore grave injustices, especially against the most vulnerable members of our community. And I would add, when it compromises the church's integrity and ability to be a messenger to the world. And so we find ourselves in the position of having to find and exercise the balance between willful blindness and excessive outrage without hope. And one of the difficulties in this is that no matter how involved the laity are, we have to be realistic about one fact, which is that the bishops have to be the ones to make these reforms. We can draw attention to it, we can apply pressure, but as long as bishops are ordaining strip club DJs, the problem will persist. As long as someone like Cardinal McElroy, who is credibly accused of covering up one of the most horrific cases of sexual abuse I've ever heard about, is being promoted to the highest metropolitan seats in the United States, I would say the problems will persist. So I would argue that we have to find ways to limit the destructiveness of bad bishops and encourage and support good bishops, which is why I would argue that there are three types of bishops, in my experience, that we should look out for as we navigate the process of church reform. The first kind seems to be extremely ubiquitous, especially here in Canada where I live, from what I've seen and what I've been told by both clergy and bishops. This kind of bishop is motivated by what I would call bureaucratic indifference. These bishops they're mere administrators. They are not pastors in any real sense. One wonders if they are people of faith at all. Their highest priority is protection of the institutions of the church, even at the cost of those institutions eventually slowly dying. Because the reality is, the church is not an institution. By necessity, it has to run institutional apparatuses, but if they do not serve the missionary purpose of the church to proclaim Christ's message of the gospel and the kingdom, then those institutions certainly aren't needed by Christ and will simply die a sad, sometimes slow and agonizing death, as so many mainline Protestant denominations are now doing. But for so many bishops, curating those institutions through meetings and budgets and HR and insurance policies. That's their highest priority, and the greatest threat to that priority is anything controversial, because controversy, it's destabilizing to well-constructed bureaucracy. But the problem is, the gospel is controversial by nature. The gospel, the incarnation, the message of Christ is not at home in this world. It is a sign of contradiction, and in some respects, I would say an emphatic, even violent renunciation of this world. Remember, Jesus said, if you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. This worldly institutional focus also encourages an episcopacy that is dreadfully out of touch with the landscape of the church in proximity to the world that it needs to evangelize today. I was told by a priest recently that bishops like this have it in their minds that in every major metropolitan city, the three most important people are the mayor, the police chief, and the bishop. In their mind, this is who every respectable person looks to for leadership. And to anyone who actually goes out into the world, we know this is the furthest thing from reality. But because these bishops are so insulated in their bureaucratic ivory towers of their chanceries and have so little firsthand experience of venturing out into the world in any missionary capacity, it's easy to convince themselves of this lie. The reality is, society is quite hostile to the church and anyone who attempts to represent it. Ask any faithful Catholic layperson who has to go out into the world to work or go to school or to participate in the civic dimensions of our society. They will tell you that to whatever degree they identify themselves as faithful Catholics, they are met with antagonism. Almost immediately after joining the Catholic Church as a young adult, I encountered people at work or at school who at best thought I was this weird eccentric to be avoided, but just as often thought I should be personally ridiculed and denounced for not being more open-minded, tolerant, or forward-thinking, or whatever. What that taught me was there's a strong and urgent need for evangelization. We need to go out and tell our story because right now the media and Hollywood are telling it for us, and it isn't flattering. It also taught me that we need to be shrewd in how we interact with the world. The world is not friendly to us, and an appreciation of that fact should be reflected in our missionary activities and strategy. But we still have a generation of bishops who think that it's 1968 and that the world will be so pleasantly surprised by the novelty of gestures of friendship and tolerance and dialogue from the church that it will be helpless to resist reciprocating those gestures. But for the most part, the world is just laughing at such self-deception in the way that the church addresses the outside world. So that's one kind of bishop, naive, out of touch, institutionalized men who don't know the first thing about how to be a pastor or what is required of the church in this day and age. And they may sound innocuous, but unfortunately, it's this kind of bishop that contributed a lot to the sex abuse cover-ups. Their priority to institutional protection superseded their responsibility to justice and doing what is obviously right. If there's a test for how far they will go to disregard Christ's commission for the church in the interests of institutionalism, that's as vivid a betrayal as you can ask for. So they are quite harmful and ironically will only ensure the demise of the church's legal and institutional standing. They won't preserve those institutions, and the fact they're so dedicated to it shows that it probably has more to do with ensuring that those institutions don't fail under their watch. But if they can just keep them going long enough for one of their successors to have to deal with it, then they will have succeeded. Okay, but then there's another category, which I would argue splits into two. It is bishops who have stepped foot into the world. They have experience as pastors and missionaries, and they are acquainted with the reality I've been trying to describe. They have first-hand experiences like all the faithful laity do when we go out and try to participate as members of society. They aren't deluded with ideas that the church is loved and respected by polite society, by non-Catholics. They feel the urgency to respond to this reality as well. Simply put, they aren't pacified and distracted by mere institutional priorities, which I would say is very encouraging. But this is where they divide into two. They sharply disagree with one another about how to respond to this reality. One side says the church needs to adapt and get with the times. She needs to become more like the world so the world will be more receptive to her, which is by definition, I would argue, self-defeating. Like, if I want a girl to like me and I so completely distort who I am and sacrifice who I am in order to attract her, if it works, is it really me she's eventually attracted to? Have I succeeded in making someone attracted to me, or just some false projection of who I might want to be in order to attract her? If the church sells itself out to the world and distorts its teachings and its practices to align with the beliefs of the world, in order for the world to embrace it, is it still the church that the world would be embracing at that point, or some counterfeit that used to be the church? Some examples of bishops who seem to be enamored with this approach are like Cardinal Supich and Cardinal McElroy. They want the church to change her teachings to better align with the doctrines of contemporary society, which are so precarious that if you just wait a decade, the world will have betrayed its own beliefs in favor of something new anyways. Which is what people don't seem to realize when it comes to selling out to the demands of the world. It isn't a process of one and done. You have to continually do it as the world continually reinvents what it honors as good and true, while denouncing what it held only a decade prior. So if you embrace those doctrines of the world as if they are true, you can't hold on to them. You will find that a decade down the road, if you stick to them, you will be denounced as the new conservative. The other kind of bishop is one who recognizes the need to go out into the world as missionaries, but insists that we have to stand firm in the apostolic tradition. We have to immerse ourselves in it and understand it and be transformed by it, and then go out and transform the world the way that the early church did. And I would identify someone like Bishop Robert Barron as being a good representative of this kind of bishop, which I expect will annoy some of my viewers who don't agree with everything he says. And that's fine. I don't agree with everything that Bishop Barron has said either, but I still admire him greatly for the unprecedented work he's done and for his example as a missionary who is probably directly involved in countless conversions through his outreach work. This third kind of bishop I'm describing is one who possesses fortitude, a virtue that is sorely lacking in the world today. Fortitude being courage to do what is right and true, even if you will suffer for it. So holding firm to the apostolic tradition in the face of a hostile world requires this exact virtue. And you see it a lot in the laity because we have to stand firm as we go out into the world. And the reason that I'm confident that Bishop Barron possesses it is because, well, just look at the generation he comes from. He was formed and ordained at a time when the vast majority of the clergy took the line of someone like Supich or McElroy. They were theological and philosophical progressives, and they would identify themselves as such in surveys. They believed the church needed to change her teachings to get with the times. And in spite of being surrounded on all sides by that climate, Barron somehow came out of the woodwork refusing to adopt that program. Like, it's easy to be ultra trad or conservative when all your friends and community around you are, but Bishop Barron would have had to traverse a lonely existence as a priest, navigating his way as a young man through a climate that was relentlessly hostile to Orthodox and conservative Christianity. The fact that anyone of that generation could come through with even slight Orthodox instincts, I would argue, is a near miracle. Not only was Barron able to stand firm, he went on to become one of the most prolific evangelists of our times. And the influence he's had on countless other evangelists is incalculable. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if it wasn't for him and his example. I vividly remember in the early days of his YouTube channel when he was publishing videos taking on the new atheists like Dawkins and Hitchens, who were at the height of their influence. He was getting just overrun with dislikes and negative comments from atheists. He was out there alone without an audience and a brand or an enterprise to hide behind. And you can go back, and it's kind of fun to do so, and look at his earliest videos and see him responding to all the hostile comments with his counter arguments. He's engaging in the comment war. He had to endure that hostile territory for years before he had built up enough of a sympathetic audience of his own that he wasn't just fighting against a hostile crowd all of the time. So those are the three kinds of bishops we have: the bureaucrat, the modernist, and the missionary. And it's important to know the difference because I think too many faithful Catholics are so used to seeing corrupt clergy that we've turned that hostility on people like Bishop Barron, who I would argue, are in some respects our only hope for the kind of reform the church needs in order to start moving in the right direction. For the episcopacy to reform, you have to know that the bureaucrats and the progressives are going to throw every obstacle in the way of good and faithful bishops seeking that reform. If we expect bishops like Barron to have any fighting chance, we can't also be resisting them and denouncing them for the tiny portion of things they say that we disagree with. If he's facing hostility from bureaucrats and progressives in front of him, he can't also have denunciations and hostility from his rear. Instead, we should be looking for men who get it, who are sincere men of faith, men who are intentionally trying to follow Jesus, and who are not naive about the relationships between a world that desperately needs to hear the gospel and the church. We need to support them and work with them in the hopes that they will have the strength to push things in the right direction. Okay, thanks for watching. These videos and this channel are only possible because of viewer support. So if you can spare some help, please consider making a contribution through my website at brianholdsworth.ca or join my locals community at brianholdsworth.locals.com, where you can interact with myself and other like-minded individuals. We actually just started a monthly Zoom meetup where we're studying some articles of St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa. So if that's interesting to you, then come join us there. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe.